as I mentioned earlier, when I saw the Rob's presentation, it struck my interest in presenting something on the lodges from Tennessee, since we're heading there for the NOAC this year for the 4th time. So by the way, this is my name and email address if you want to contact me. But this is a picture of my first conclave patch, the first conclave I attended, and where I got the itch, if you will, to collect the issues from my state. I was a member of Pellissippi Lodge 230 out of Knoxville. So, oh well, and speaking of that and of the classics, here I am as a 16-year-old. This will be the picture you'll get, and my good friend Alan Fugit, both of us just having come from the 1975 National OA Conference. Just goes to show you that in a small town, anybody can make the paper. But there we are. Now, this picture then represents the entirety of my collection after the 75 NOAC. All right, that's where I definitely got the bug, if you will. And you'll notice I was unable to pick up any 2 pieces or NOAC flaps at that NOAC. But that was it. Now the collection has grown a little bit since then, but that's where we started. What we'll do is we'll start with Sequoyah Lodge 184 and go east to west, and we'll jump right in with Sequoyah. I'll try to not make this too long because I can talk all day on a lot of this stuff. Sequoyah was chartered in, by the way, from Johnson City, Tennessee, Northeast Tennessee, and chartered in 1940. They had a WAB issue. This is their R1, so it was issued obviously pre-1952. It wasn't until 57 that they issued their first flap, and this F1 ran for 6 to 7 years until about 64, 65, when they replaced it with their S1, which then became a service issue restriction. And then in 70, 71 or so, they decided to issue Brotherhood and Vigil flaps. Now, these are pretty uncommon. The more uncommon of the two is the Brotherhood flap, the cut edge, red cut edge, presumably because they were distributed faster among the Brotherhood members. So the Brotherhood cut edge is more difficult to find mint. You see these, they're fairly uncommon, but you still see these. When they ran out of the Brotherhood, they ordered a rolled edge, also restricted to 2 per life, and they needed more ordeal flaps, so they ordered this from the same manufacturer at the same time. These came back with Brotherhood bars, which were a mistake. They used these as an ordeal flap, and this was about 1975, so these are 75, 76 era. And then when they ran out, they ordered the S6, which I believe is the sleeper among the early Sequoyah issues. They needed some more ordeal flaps, so you can tell they ordered from a different company. This is a rolled edge flap with no Brotherhood bars, okay, and no fleur-de-lis. This one, for comparison, is one I bought off of an auction that was listed as an S6, but one can tell it's the same as this S4, just thread break with no Brotherhood bars. This one is tough to find. Right after they finished with those, they issued the fleur-de-lis. So this was in that 1977 timeframe when National was asking all the lodges to put BSA or fleur-de-lis or something like that on the patches. It could be asked, because the S6 is so difficult to find, could this be a thread break of the S7? And I suppose it could be, but I've seen enough of these to believe that this is a separate issue. Just for comparison's sake, and not that it means anything, this is the back of my S6. This is the back of my S7. I'm not sure that means anything. I wish we had more to compare to see if that was a legitimate difference, but the S6 is the one to find among all of those. It's usually the last one people need, believe it or not, and not those restricted other ones. Now, this is an interesting piece. If you'll notice here, this Sequoyah flap has a 108 on it, okay? When Sequoyah decided to change over, when many of the other lodges were changing over to Flatt, they liked the look of the Sequoyah 108 F1. And as you can see, both of these were gear emblem shaped, made. So my understanding is they asked the gear emblem to sort of copy the Sequoyah, but make some small changes. And so what they got back on the first run was this flap with 108 on it. Now, legend has it, put legend in quotes, that the professional advisor to the lodge opened the box, realized the mistake, closed the box up, and mailed them back and rejected them, but not before he took a few out and put them in his drawer, right? And so there are a few of these Sequoyah 108 flaps out there, but very, very few. Guy Hatfield, actually, when he put his first flap collection together back in '79, listed this as the Sequoyah first flap. And so technically it was the first one to arrive at the council office, but not the first one actually issued. Kind of an oddball story, but I think you could, back in the day, I think you could probably understand why a mistake like that could have been made. Just in communication, they may have said, well, here's what we want to do, reverse the arrow, put the Sequoyah name over here, change the totem, and then put the number over there, right? And so they did. They just used the same number. Here's another one. Here's another couple of issues of interest. These are the delegate neckerchiefs to the 52 and the 56 NOACs. The 52 NOAC delegate neckerchief has the R1, the 56 has the R2. So we know that 57 or thereafter was the time frame for the F1. I've heard through the years that other lodges have stated that their lodge also used these neckerchiefs these blank neckerchiefs, if you will, for their delegate or contingent neckerchiefs to these conferences. And I won't argue that point, but I will make the statement of my belief that these actually originated from Sequoyah. And I'll give you two examples. One, although you don't see these very often, when you do see them, they usually have the Sequoyah emblem on them, or they're blank, one of the two. And again, the professional advisor that was in charge of the OA in this lodge during the 50s was also prolific in making, was the camp director at their council camp, Camp Tom Howard, and was prolific in making neckerchiefs for Camp Tom Howard staff and campers from 1950 to 1963. This is just a small spattering of the different Camp Tom Howard neckerchiefs, and they come in multiple colors for years, and staff, and usually had the shape of the Camp Tom Howard patch for that year there. So I think it stands, at least from my reasoning, to say that this is very similar to those and probably was ordered by this fellow. Now, I'm not saying that other lodges didn't use this. Perhaps that professional advisor offered these blanks to other lodges. Perhaps he traded them and then they were brought back. And if a lodge had a 3-inch round emblem, they put it in there. But I think these things originated from Sequoyah. Netopolis chapter is from Kingsport, and they had several through the late 60s and 1970s chapter issues, which are uncommon. The most difficult one to find is the bicentennial one, but nowhere does it say actually chapter. So you'd have to know that these are chapter issues. And then there's this neckerchief, which is really unlisted, but is the neckerchief given to the participants who went to the 65 Fall Fellowship from Sequoyah. Has nothing, it doesn't say Sequoyah on it. And those who collect neckerchiefs might recognize that Atik Lodge 139 in Pennsylvania issued several of these with this design, different colors. There may have been another lodge or two that did the same, but this this unnamed neckerchief on a sort of a grayish tan cloth was issued at the 65 Fall Fellowship for Sequoyah. I have come across 3 of these. All 3 of them came from Sequoyah members from the mid-60s. 2 of them told me that, yes, that's the neckerchief they were issued at the 65 Fall Fellowship. I actually also have an iron-on transfer of this, and so I don't think these are silk screened or were silk screened. I think they were used as an iron-on transfer, which may be why you see so many different colors from Autic, and perhaps is why Sequoyah may have gotten a hold of these iron-on transfers and perhaps just removed the Autic name and used it. But that's kind of a squirrely neckerchief and usually not known. Now here's a couple of other little odd items, and these came from a lodge chief of this era from Sequoyah. Those of you who were around might remember that in the 1975, 1977 NOAC eras, the Alangomat program was in its infancy. And in 1978, Sequoyah decided to use the Alangomat program, and they made these for their Alangomats to be worn on their uniform to recognize them. You'll notice that it's misspelled and that they're handmade. And I didn't get the complete story, but these are obviously not listed as Alangomat issues because they are painted wood chips, basically, with a string to be worn as a dangle. But nonetheless, an interesting piece of Sequoyah history. All right, let's move on. Let's move a little bit farther west to Knoxville, Tennessee. This is a picture of the Pellissippi Lodge charter members. They were inducted at the end of the camp season in 1942 at Camp Pellissippi. And what I want you to notice out of here is that all of them are wearing a neckerchief. Looks like, even though it's just a poor black and white copy, is a 2-tone neckerchief with white piping. I suspect most of these were camp staff members at the time, but there were 11 of them. And this is that neckerchief. This is probably, this and the 111 R1 are probably the 2 rarest pieces of early Order of the Arrow lodge memorabilia, because these were produced only for those first 11 members, and the lodge did not continue to issue this neckerchief after this charter induction. Some of them have the 42 Camp Pellissippi patch on them. Some don't. Some do not. My example has it, and I'm actually glad it does, because it helps to authenticate it, because otherwise it would be a neckerchief that might not be so difficult to replicate. It was 10 years later that Pellissippi had their first emblem, and this is their R1. They ordered these through a local sporting goods store in Knoxville, who then jobbed it out to Chicago Embroidery. They ordered them before the 52 NOAC, but they didn't get them back until after the 52 NOAC. And speaking of pieces showing up all over the place, Jim Montgomery was the national conference chief that year and from Pellissippi Lodge. And once these came in, Jim mailed one to every one of his conference committee and key staff. So when we were trying to collect these 20 years later in the mid-70s, looking for them, we couldn't find these locally anywhere. But occasionally you'd show up at a traderie in Pittsburgh or someplace, and somebody would have one. And we all figured, well, that's what happened to them. Jim mailed out a big stack of these things, and they're finally slowly but surely turned up through the years. In '56, they issued their first flap. My father actually took his ordeal in '56 in Pellissippi and was issued this one. When those ran out, they changed companies and made another one. This one has a silver eye, and you'll when you talk Pellissippi Lodge lingo, this was called the Silver Eye. And then when these ran out, they issued a rolled edge flap with 230 on it. Now this one is, again, probably the sleeper of the bunch, has embroidery around, completely around the red tongue. Subsequent issues like this did not, and are very common. This was the one that was issued prior to the 60 Jamboree. So those got distributed a lot at the 60 Jamboree. Then in 65, Pellissippi issued this 50th anniversary of the Order of the Arrow flap, made a lot of these. They're actually fairly common and were pretty well distributed. After that, they went to this stock design, which was used for 10 years, and it was my ordeal flap because they used it for so long. Interrupted by a few other issues when they were trying to save money and went to a different manufacturer. In 68, they ordered another loom of these, and for some reason came back by mistake. It was not intentional, that it came back with a gold border. These are actually kind of neat, and was the flap that I chose to wear on my uniform when I was a kid, because I always thought this one looked better than that one, and it was more uncommon. Around 70, 71, they decided to change companies. What they got was a cheaper flap because it was about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the standard flap, and we call it the Two Mountain. Only has two purple peaks, an uncommon issue. And then in 73, trying to save money again, they ordered from another company, and this one we call the Upstitch because all of the background is vertically embroidered. These all were either issued to the 73 ordeal candidates or members, and then or were taken to the 73 Jamboree and traded off. So I've seen a lot of these come through in members who went to the 73 Jamboree. These were traded a lot. And here's the one Johnny was talking about earlier. In 77, Pellissippi hosted the NOAC for the first time. This summer will be the 4th time. And I was host lodge chief and designed this flap to commemorate that. We made 2,000 of them, as Johnny said, and they were pretty common. They were very popular. And I used the Tisquantum 164S1 as my inspiration for this shape. So I'm going to give credit to the Northeast there for using this shape. We made a silver border of the same thing, and these were the ones given to lodge workers. So this was considered the staff flap. Just enough were made that one per person was issued. Some people got 2, but there weren't very many of these issued. So this is the one defined, the silver border. These are pretty common. And then, not to get too recent, but the first conclave host, for those of you who collect conclave stuff from the state of Tennessee, and there are a lot of you out there, this was the first conclave host flap, and we call it the lavender. There were 179 of those issued, 1 per work weekend preparing for conclave. Those are pretty hard to find. There are lots of other colors, but this is the one to find, the purplish looking. 83 or so, Pellissippi finally decided to try Ordeal Brotherhood and Vigil flaps. They lasted pretty much 1 year. So those are not very common. And then this one last flap here, issued in 93, was the first of many 50th anniversary flaps for the lodge. This one more difficult to find because it does not have a fleur-de-lis. Should have had a fleur-de-lis there. So all of those were issued to the Ordeal members that year and got kind of escaped. Wasn't really realized, frankly, until the next order came in. Among neckerchiefs, this is the first, really not the first neckerchief, but the first one issued to the general membership in 62, was issued at 1 per life. And there were several others after that, but this is the yellow one, is the one to have. In 75, they issued this as a pie. but the thing was too big and too bulky to put on a neckerchief, so no one wore it as a neckerchief. Everybody put it on their red jacket. When they ran out, they ordered these, changed it a little bit. Looks more like the fox that we're used to rather than the wolf. And most of those got traded at the 77 NOAC. And once again, because of that, this is the harder one to find among those who collect this lodge. An interesting sidebar are the delegate neckerchiefs to the national conference. Pellissippi had some pretty significant contingents back then, and there are delegate neckerchiefs for members from 63, 65, 67, 69, 71, and 75, all of which were limited only to the delegates and typically only issued at one per person. So these are among the most difficult pieces to find, as they are in other lodges like that. This one in particular is kind of interesting. By the way, on the arrow, it says National OA Conference. So if you were a kid back in the 60s and 70s and knew of Mad Magazine, you might recognize this little cartoon down here. I see Michael shaking his head. Whoever designed this for the lodge, I'm confident, took this image off of this character called Carbuncle out of Mad Magazine and made the requisite changes here and put that on there. So I suspect that in 65, those Pellissippi members wearing that were pretty popular, just because of that odd thing that they did there with Mad Magazine. Some of the other oddball pieces, and obviously this is my lodge, so I spend more time on this one, but this is the first fall fellowship patch, one of the more uncommon fall fellowship patches 10 years later. And then probably the rarest piece is this silk screen. The lodge did not order a patch or something. They just made a silk screen and told you to bring your own t-shirt and we'll silk screen the fellowship emblem on it. I wish I had a pack of t-shirts, but I only had one. So this one's probably the hardest thing to find. In addition, this little piece right here, which if you're lucky, you could probably find in a dollar bin, was the 1966 Fall Fellowship leather neckerchief slide. A stock item, I think. I've seen these with other printing on them, but this actually was the 230 1966. And then they had their own totem slides as well. And not to forget mugs, but there's Pellissippi's first mug, which is fairly uncommon as well. Let's move on again a little bit farther west to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Talladega Lodge, which chartered in 1957. Members of the ritual team from Pellissippi came down to their council camp, and about 40 or so, I think, members were inducted, and this is their first flap. Now, these were restricted to 1 or 2 per person. When they ran out of that F1, they issued a rolled edge version, also heavily restricted, small lodge. If you're a F1 collector or first flap collector, you'll know that this is one of the more difficult first flaps to find, and really difficult to find mint, because most of them were sewn. It's my contention that the F2 is probably equally as difficult, but not nearly as in demand because it's an F2. Now, because of the pressure from other lodges in the section, because they had nothing to trade in 65, when they hosted the conclave that year, they made this trading flap. And it was not well received within the lodge because their eagle looked like a goose, and they actually call it the brown goose as a result. Today, it's actually a pretty good flap and is their S1. After this issue, they dropped their restriction and went to something that looked kind of like this without the double X, and they used that flap for, again, about 10 or so years, and then issued this in 75. And this was the first time they'd changed designs in about 10 years, and showed up with these at the 75 conclave, which was my first conclave. Again, from issue perspectives, The S3 was the double X flap. It was, I think, supposed to be XV. It was actually their 15th anniversary, but it came out as XX and they used it. And they corrected that in 77 by issuing a round at 2 per member with the true 20th on it. In their 25th anniversary year, they issued this silver Mylar flap, which was just their general flap for that year. But then the banquet flap was issued at 1 or 2 per person. And this is probably the real sleeper of the bunch. This XXV, you can tell it's kind of crudely embroidered. Very few of them made. This is the one defined, the 25th anniversary banquet flap. Taladondeganu had neckerchiefs. These are the 1960s versions. Don't know if they were restricted, but they're uncommon. And then about 1970, 71 or so, they issued their first pie. This was a 1 per life at Brotherhood neckerchief patch, and very uncommon, tough to find. When they ran out in the mid 70s, they were really too expensive to redo, so they went with an embroidered version, which are almost equally difficult to find, but not near as desirable. This little Chief John Ross canoe trek patch was a Taladondeganu Lodge issue, but offered to anyone who did the canoe trek. So any scout or anyone, kind of like a medal at a trail medal, they could buy this from the lodge for $1 if they completed the canoe trek. And then, although this is a more recent issue, probably 25 or so years old now, it's one of the more uncommon issues from the lodge, using the old design. All right, let's go a little bit farther west now, talk about Nashville, Tennessee, Wahanasa Lodge, which is the oldest lodge in the state of Tennessee. This is the other of the two that I consider the holy grail among the Tennessee Order of the Arrow issues. This is the 111R1. I saw a little thing about that Paul Myers put in there. It says, why is there 221 on the patch? And I answered Paul back, and I said that's just poor silk screening. But this came out pre-1950, and this is one of two that are known to exist today. There's reference to it in the literature from the lodge, and this one came from a lodge member at the time, but third hand. So none of us really know if this was made maybe for the 48 National Conference or for the 50 National Conference. Perhaps when the members went to 48 and saw other people doing it, they decided to do that before they went to the 50 conference. That's what's expected. So this may have been the first issue and an attempt to have an emblem prior to going to the 1950 National Conference, but we're not sure of that. In any event, they're very scarce. And around 52 or so, then you start seeing this. I believe, you have to correct me on this, this may be a WAB issue. So this would have been pre-1950 or 52 or before. Then it was about 56 when, again, they issued their first flap, and then that ran for several years. And then they issued the only woven in the early era, which started this red, white, and blue design that you see that's common through Wahanasa for the next several years. Let's see, in 65 or so, they started issuing this black border issue, and this ran for 6, 7, 8 different years. These were always restricted, had somewhat of a no trading restriction on them. I was always told that they were 1 per year, although I'm not really confident of that, but in some fashion they were restricted. I can tell you that when you went to a section conference or area conference, this was a very tough piece to get. And because of that, in 75, they decided to issue Ordeal Brotherhood and Vigil flaps and drop their restriction. So this was first issued pretty much right before that 75 conclave, and were pretty popular because most people weren't able to get a lodge issue from Wayanasa for many years before. Among the sleepers here, again, for those of you collect section stuff, this was the 1981 Host Lodge flap, and they were issued one per work weekend, maximum two, ordered after you did your work and then mailed to you. That's a tough piece to find. And then there were a few oddball pieces along the way. This happens to be a Vigil flap with fleur-de-lis that came back instead of with a gold border, with a black border. It was used as the Vigil. I think it was a mistake, but of that bunch, this one's the one to find. Wayanasa had neckerchiefs as well. These were 60s era. This was the first one, and then they had their 1965 50th anniversary of the OA neckerchief. Those are fairly uncommon. Let's move a little farther west to Jackson, Tennessee, and Itawamba. And this is one, I'll admit, this is one of my favorite lodges to collect. Again, because their early issues are so difficult to get. To the left of the screen here is an arrow band, a sash, and the camp patch of an inductee that year. I got this from this gentleman who was inducted at that camp session, and this is his sash. Now, Itawamba chartered in '43, so this came from someone who was inducted during their charter year, but I don't really know how many inductions they had. Perhaps they had, 4 or 5 that year, one at each week of their camp. But this, one might say, is the first issue. As in all of our lodges, there was an arrow band probably before there was anything else. Now, around 52 or so, again, Itawamba issued their first patch, and there are a couple of different varieties of this. The more narrow variety is the first issue, X1A, and you can tell this one's a little bit wider. It came as a second run. These are actually easier to find, in my opinion, than the F1, which came out about 57, and were restricted and were very difficult to get. And again, if you're a first flap collector, you'll know that these have always been somewhat at the top of the list of the difficult pieces. And again, also difficult to find in mint condition. When these ran out, they issued a rolled edge version of this, all similarly difficult, but not near as desirable. And then in '62, it came out with their S1, their first solid, and really changed up their design. This one is called by lodge members the Rainbow, for all the different colors. And it was a one loom flap, also restricted. And for S1 collectors, a pretty tough issue to find. Around 64, 65, they started with, again, with this design, and you'll see that the tulip poplar leaf and tulip poplar blossom, which is the state tree of Tennessee, is their totem. And you'll see this tulip poplar leaf and blossom on their restricted flaps, okay, which I'll get to. And these are other varieties or other issues, 25th anniversary, 30th anniversary. This S3, though, is another sleeper. I'll talk about this because it's worth mentioning. That Itawamba folks would not let me live it down if I didn't mention this. When they were ordering the 25th anniversary flaps, they needed some more ordeal or some more membership flaps because these had run out. So they ordered some more of these, and they came back. My understanding is they came back with a red cut edge without the XXV, and they didn't intend that to happen. So they sent them back and had them rebordered. My father's cousin, this was my father's cousin's ordeal flap in 1968. So I know this story to be true. And this is a tough piece to find. Probably the most difficult of all of the flaps is the S3 to find in the lodge, particularly of the classic issues. I am told by the Itawamba folks that if you tear back this border a little bit, you'll see the red cut edge border under it. I've never done that. I'm not willing to do that, but it's an interesting story that I didn't know until recently as well. Now, again, because of pressure from other lodges at section conferences and things, Itawamba decided to start issuing a trading patches. This was their first one, late 1960s. And you'll notice that on all these trading flaps, they did not put their totem. Okay, so they reserve the totem for their restricted issues and put something else on their trading issues. This was the first one. They stuck an image there, and subsequently they used the Camp McMorris emblem of the time on trading issues, and these were early 70s, and then mid 70s they started with a very colorful trading flap, which was very popular. Here are a bunch of others, just odds and ends through the years. All of these are difficult to find, again, because if they're a restricted issue, you're going to see that tulip popular leaf and blossom, and there's the 35th and what they call the John Deere flap in 81. A lot of these were taken to the 81 Jambo. So again, you'll see these out there spread out. This is an interesting piece because at the 77 section conference or section conclave, a guy was trading these out of the back of his truck in the parking lot. This is the fake of that rainbow S1. I don't know who that guy was. I traded a flap 1-for-1 for this, and that's the only one I've ever had. And that's also for folks who are purists of Itawamba collectors. This is a hard one to find for some reason. Itawamba had restricted neckerchiefs as well. This one's circa 1965, the P1 issued on a dark green neckerchief. Those ran out and they reordered, probably because of cost, dropped the size some, issued on a light green neckerchief. A few of these were not sewn to the neckerchief cloth. So you'll see a few of these that are meant unsewn, but they were intended to be issued this way. I've never seen one of these not sewn on. Itawamba had a few other, all of their anniversary neckerchiefs are kind of squirrely, hard to find. Now let's go a little bit farther west and talk about Chickasay Lodge from Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I'll state up front that I'm not going to go into the current lodge, probably because I can't correctly pronounce the name, but more because this is a discussion on the classic issues. So Chickasay with an H was the name of the lodge in Memphis. And these were issued around 51 or so. This is the first R1 first issue. When they reordered, they got back something that said Chickasaw. Now, that was the council name. And again, legend has it that when they got these back, they realized the mistake, but they did not return them. Many of these, I'm told, were given to the kids who went to the 53 Jamboree out west and were traded. So a lot of these, again, show up in collections outside the state because they were distributed nationwide at the 53 National Jamboree. Some use this as a different name or a misspelled name for their collection. As far as I'm concerned, they're equally rare. They're really not that rare. They're pretty much equal. You can find one just like you can find the other. Most of the Chickasay issues were fairly common because it was a pretty large lodge. Memphis was headquarters for Region 5, so it's pretty large lodge. The S1 was their first flap, and it was late 50s or so. It's a very common first flap, and they used this design all the way through the 70s or so. They didn't have their F1, their twill, until around 1970. So the F1 in this case was not their first flap. And this one ran about, these designs ran to about 74 or so. So they used this for a good 18 or so years, and very, very commonly seen. In 74, they decided to sort of change things up a little bit and issued Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil red border 25th anniversary issues. And again, these were fairly popular at that 75 conclave that I attended as my first conclave. Not restricted, but very, very limited in how many they were made, particularly the Vigil issue. Right after that, they issued Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil flaps, unrestricted, but much more colorful and therefore much more desirable. They used this design for many, many years. And you'll see Ordeal, Brotherhood, and Vigil flaps similar to this running for the next 20 or so years with FDL and BSA and various. There aren't too many sleepers among this. The sleepers among the Chickasee issues, in my opinion, are the activity patches. And I'll admit, when I was collecting, when many of us were collecting back then, lodge activity patches were just barely above camporee patches as far as what we thought of collecting those things. I did not tend to collect those, and it took me 20 or some odd years to correct my mistake and go back and start trying to find those. Here are some of them that are among the more uncommon. And when you see some of these sewn to a neckerchief, and I believe there's actually one on eBay right now, not this one, but a different year. The ones sewn to a neckerchief, I believe, were actually issued to the Lodge Executive Committee or to the staff of that fall fellowship. So it's the same patch. Generally, it's just issued on a neckerchief, and they were the quote staff issue for that fellowship. I think this is the first fall fellowship. We'll call it fall powwow then. And they had, like most of us, several years running. Chickasee had a pie. These were restricted. I think it was the only restricted piece in their early issues. And there are a couple of different varieties of that, notably because of the oval O and the round O. But these were 1960s, early 70s issues. After that, they went to a embroidered on the cloth, also restricted, and then went to a silkscreen. And these are much more common. These are fairly uncommon. Those are fairly uncommon for their period, but these are actually fairly common. And to kind of cap it off, in 1985, I tried to take all of this knowledge that I generated over that 10-year period between that first conclave in 75 and 85 and put a book together that I called The Order of the Arrow in Kentucky and Tennessee. And by that time, the conclave or the section had included both Kentucky and Tennessee, and used and tried to get as much information as I could about the history of the lodges, put it on paper. This was prior to the day of Microsoft Word, so all this stuff had to be typed out prior to any kind of word processor. So I had to make photocopies, shrunk down, cut them out, paste them on the piece of paper, and then Xerox all these things, which I then took to the 85 section conclave and sold them to interested folks for $5 a copy. There are a few copies still exist. If you happen to want a digital copy of this, feel free to email me and I'll send you one, because years later I got so many requests for this that I finally digitized it and I can send you a PDF copy. But again, it talks about all the lodge issues sequentially, chronologically, as well as the section conference, area conference patches, prior lodges, 241 Tomahawk, 155 Michiganaqua, all those kind of things. So kind of an interesting thing, but that's it. And that's a very quick recap of the classic issues of the state of Tennessee. right. Now, I failed to mention, you can see in the background, this is the Region 5 shield. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, Memphis was headquarters for Region 5 back at the time. So they used that Region 5 shield in their design. It's still there. I think these were pre-72 or so. And then that Region 5 shield got dropped after that. Wahanasa has an eagle. In fact, I think Wahanasa means home of eagles. That's the interpretation of that. But Talladega has I think that's a golden eagle.
Is that because 111 is the home lodge of 101st Airborne?
I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that, but that's a good point.
Just some information, the blue neckerchiefs, and I got this from the lodge chief who was had served 2 terms at that time. The blue neckerchiefs were set up to be 1 per life, and the scouts had to sign that they had received their 1 neckerchief. Then the silk screens were 2 per year. On the blue neckerchiefs, the first ones were pies sewn onto the neckerchiefs, and there were 2 variations, the dark blue and the medium blue.
Right.
And then after that, they were embroidered, and there were a couple of versions of those. When you go to silk screen, you're showing 2 of the 3.
I mean, this was the era, as you know, if you've collected wovens, this was the era when, 30 or 40 lodges did this, and they all were doing it at about the same time. I have seen out of the National Supply catalogs, these being offered, and it may well be that because that one lodge did it, and then it showed up in the National Supply catalog that other lodges said, hey, that looks kind of cool. Let's do that. But they're Apache emblem made, like most of them were at that time.
I can put in that at the time, the minimum order for a woven patch was huge, like 500 pieces.
I could see that because this piece ran for probably 3 or 4 years before their S1 was issued, mid-60s.
Apache is located in New York City, and they make a lot of labels for all the big manufacturers like Lee and Wrangler and all this stuff.